But guys, make sure you take it, especially those of you that have been missing those quizzes. You don't get opportunities to retake those quizzes, so make sure you take it. Okay, let's go. And here we go, share now. And we were at Stamp Act, if I'm not mistaken, or had we already passed the Stamp Act? I think we were right at...
We're like starting the Stamp Act.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, here we go. Okay, so in 1765, they are still, the English, the British, are wanting revenue. They haven't been very successful at getting it from the colonies. And so in 1765, March, they pass a new law called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax that really is going to affect the majority of the colonists, because it's a tax on anything that is printed or published. It's a tax on the paper you use if it's printed. So it would be a tax on legal documents, a tax on marriage licenses, wills, land transfers, newspapers, anything that is printed or written on. And you even had a tax on playing cards, you know, cards to play games. There has to be a stamp on it. So it affects pretty much everyone in the colonists. And you needed to have this seal, this stamp on your paper or on your cards or on your printed material. Overall, because this affects the majority of the colonists, you're going to see a huge, huge uproar. Very negative response on the part of the colonists. And so we basically call this now the Stamp Act crisis, because there are protests, there are demonstrations, we have new groups that are rebelling against this, and this is just up and down the colonies. The idea was that it would go into effect November of 1765, when all the stamp distributors had been placed in the correct ports of entry and correct towns. And the idea would be this would be all over, starting at the same time. Well, the colonists are just, no, we don't like this. And you really kind of see in Virginia, they are taking the lead. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, one of the representatives, is going to make a very, very famous speech talking about how Great Britain did not have the authority to tax them. And he comes up with this phrase, no taxation without representation. And since that speech, we have used that same kind of slogan, that same kind of remember the Alamo type of phrase, so that we can remember really what was at issue for many of these colonists. So Patrick Henry and the Virginia House of Burgesses are going to pass what is known as the Virginia Resolves. The Virginia Resolves are basically like a declaration. We resolve. It's not a law. It's just kind of, we declare. The Virginia Resolves state that since they were a representative assembly, a parliamentary representative assembly, they represented their constituents, that really only they had the authority to pass taxes over Virginia. Virginia could only pass taxes over Virginia. No taxation without representation. Anything that was different than that was against their rights as citizens. And this idea is really spreading quickly throughout the colonies. And for many of the colonists, it's alarm bells. Like, wait, what's going on? Why are they taxing us? We don't have any representation over there. They don't have the authority to do this. Now, bear in mind, they have been taxed all along. It's just this is now a much more widespread and a much more enforced type of tax. The other thing is that the colonists have matured. They are more in population. They are used to representation. They've changed. In Boston, what you see is a lot of protest. In fact, you can say the majority of the protest will be in this huge port city, well, huge for the colonial times. And there is going to be a group known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a club, a gathering of men, and they came from very diverse groups. One of the founders was Samuel Adams. He was kind of a very well-known figure in Boston. He was an owner of a newspaper called Journal of the Times that could be very sensationalistic. He was also a tavern owner, meaning he owned some bars, one actually, and that made him his ears to the ground. He's picking up what the people are saying. He has a cousin named John Adams. John Adams was a very well-respected lawyer in Boston. Both of these men are going to be among the leaders that are starting to say our natural rights are being violated. We need to protest. They and others in Boston will get together and create this Sons of Liberty. And when I say it's a very diverse group, so you have the educated John Adams, a very well-known lawyer, and then you would have sailors off the wharf of Boston, farmers from out in rural areas. You would have wealthy people and lower class, poor guys. I mean, it was just a very mix. And what you see is protest. They are organizing protests. They are demonstrating in Boston against the Stamp Act. Sometimes their protests could go too far, meaning they could get violent. They could get belligerent. The Daughters of Liberty are kind of the female counterpart. Usually the wives of the Sons of Liberty, but they tended to be basically the women who are promoting this idea of no taxation without representation. Now, the Daughters of Liberty, since the majority of them would have been housewives, what they did is promote a boycott. Don't buy British goods. Boycott British goods. Don't buy them in your household. In October of 1765, in New York City, there is an intercolonial congress or convention. Representatives from the colonies, all colonies except Georgia, are going to meet to discuss what to do about the Stamp Act. Notice, all of the colonies. The only one that really doesn't send anything is Georgia, because Georgia is still kind of trying to figure out what they do, but they do send some representation, just not kind of official. Anyhow, at the Stamp Act Congress, you get, not like the Albany Congress where you didn't get all 13, here you're getting across the colonies. You're not just getting a set few. So we can really say this is a major intercolonial gathering. And they come up with a declaration, a formal petition, a formal document. And no, this is not Declaration of Independence. It is a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And so what this declaration is stating is that they are English citizens, they are loyal English citizens, but they also, as English citizens, have rights. And one of those rights is to be represented in the English government, Parliament. And Parliament cannot tax them without any kind of representation. They need to have a say. They also advocate a boycott, and they basically are sending out word to all 13 colonies, do not buy British goods. So kind of taking the idea from the Daughters of Liberty. There is going to be a 40% drop in buying of British goods. When you think about it, 1/4 of the British trade, the trade in England, 1/4 of their trading business was having trade with the American colonies. 1/4 of all their trade. I mean, that's a big chunk. And now there's basically almost half, almost 50% drop in that business. That's a huge, huge dent in their business. And you can see how boycotting can be one of the most effective tools that the colonists have. The Sons of Liberty will continue their attacks. In fact, they are now starting to attack stamp distributors across the colonies, again, particularly in the Boston and the Massachusetts area. And there is a newspaper drawing back from those days about the Sons of Liberty attacking stamp distributors. They could be quite violent. I mean, there were instances of them pouring honey over all these stamp distributors and then putting feathers over them or other hot boiling substances over them. They could be quite violent and quite intimidating. We're not. Oh, sorry. I jumped ahead. But back to that boycott. It was a huge tool for the colonies. I don't think they even realized how effective the boycott would be. It was just beyond effective. The merchants in England that had been trading with the colonies are seeing almost a 50%, a 40% drop in their trade. I mean, they're not happy. They are putting a lot of pressure on Parliament to get rid of the Stamp Act because they want to trade again. They want business again. They are putting a lot of pressure on the new Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham. So this boycott is huge, much more than the protests. Much more than even the violent protests. It's this boycott that's putting a lot of pressure on Parliament through the English merchants. The slogan that they were using in the Americas, save your money and you save your country. They're not talking about the US. They're talking about you save your country, you save England because you're allowing representation for us and for all Englishmen. So Lord Rockingham, who is the new prime minister, is having to deal with this. And he's under a lot of pressure, especially from his own English merchants. Don't worry about the Rockinghamites there. I always leave it there because I just like the sound. Lord of Rockingham and Rockinghamites. Those are his followers, obviously, and those that had put him into office. But it just sounds so interesting. Rockinghamites, his followers. Anyhow, what happens? Parliament bows to this pressure. They repeal the Stamp Act in March 1766. This is a pretty big deal in the colonies. They are feeling very strong about this. They are beyond elated. They are excited. In the Boston port, in the harbor, they are having fireworks over the harbor once they hear about the Stamp Act being repealed. I mean, this is huge. They will also hear that another law was passed. Same month, kind of together. We have the Stamp Act, and yes, we're repealing it, but we're passing another act. It was the Declaratory Act, also passed that same month in 1766. The colonists, well, in their excitement about repealing the Stamp Act, in their excitement in realizing that the boycott had been so effective, they overlooked the significance of the Declaratory Act. They overlooked and ignored the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act was a lot more powerful than what they had imagined. Maybe even more powerful than any tax act that would be passed. Because the Declaratory Act stated, Parliament alone has the authority to pass laws over the American colonies in all cases whatsoever, including taxes. Parliament has parliamentary supremacy over the colonies. And what does this all mean? It basically means that Parliament alone can pass whatever law they want over the colonies. They have the supreme, the last, the official say over the colonies. And it has nothing to do with the colonies boycotting. It has nothing to do with the colonies getting representation. Parliament is above the colonies. It is huge. I mean, they are basically saying, we are the end all be all, so get used to it. The colonists ignored this act because they were so excited about the Stamp Act. They were so excited that the boycott had been so successful. They're not understanding or realizing really the significance of the Declaratory Act. In 1767, England still needs revenue. I mean, they're still hoping to generate revenue both in England and across the colonies. Lord Townsend, one of the new ministers, is going to basically organize some new tax acts. Hold on, guys. I gotta do one thing. I hear something happening over here in my house, so hold on. Okay, sorry, guys. The Townsend Acts were passed, named for Lord Townsend. And the idea was, again, trying to get the colonists to offset some of the expenses in the colonists, like paying the royal governments, the royal governors that are in the colonies, trying to generate some more revenue for the frontier. I mean, the idea is, again, we're trying to get the colonies, England says, to pay some of the share. They put a tax now, a duty. A duty is a tax on things that are imported, on items like cloth, lead, glass, paper, and tea, as well as a couple of other things. So again, taxes are being passed without the colonists' representation. Other things that are attached to the Townsend Acts are the writs of assistance. Again, kind of like you had seen in the Stamp Act, that there were these general warrants issued out so that English officials could then go onto private property, warehouses, homes, or wherever, stores, to see if there is any smuggling. They set up an American Board of Customs Commissioners, which was headquartered in Boston, but they had courts in Philadelphia, Charlestown, and other areas of Boston. The Townsend Acts are not well received. Again, the colonists quickly mobilize, they organize, they start protesting. You've got the Sons of Liberty out there protesting again, and the boycott starts up again. Sons of Liberty are, even as they're marching and protesting, are making people take oaths of non-consumption, they called. What it meant that you wouldn't even consume a British good. Sons of Liberty, they were quite powerful, quite influential, but they could pressure, let's say, with a lot of strength, even violence. We call it the rabble power or the power of the mob. And we've seen it lately. Sometimes demonstrations are started off with, and protests are started off with the best of intentions and with the most wonderful ideas, but more and more people get together. One person starts acting in a certain way, impassioned, and things can go, as they would say, helter-skelter, a little bit off very quickly. And violence and destruction can happen quickly, and people just follow. And perhaps had they not been in that kind of mob, things wouldn't have escalated, but they can. So there's always that question, that fear when you see a very large group of people, because people tend to follow people. Anyhow, in 1768, in answer to the Townsend Acts, Massachusetts House of Representatives, this is the Massachusetts Colonies Legislative Assembly House, issues a circular letter. A circular letter really is just a statement, a thesis, so to speak, an argument, an idea that you present in a formal way on paper, print it out, and you circulate it around. And in this instance, this circular letter is circulated to all the other colonial assemblies. That's the point of the Massachusetts circular letter from their House of Representatives, to be circulated across the different representative assembly houses in the colonies. And it stated that the Townshend Acts violated their rights. It violated this idea, this right they had of, if you're going to be taxed, you have to be represented. It then goes on to say, what do we do about it? Other colonies, what should we do about it? How do we get around it? I mean, notice they're saying, how do we get around these acts? What do we do? And most of the colonies, these assembly houses, initially, they ignore it. They get it. They may read it, maybe in their assembly houses. Other people may have said, oh, good idea, or maybe somebody said a bad idea. But overall, in the colonies, there's a sense of, okay, and it just kind of dies there. It's in essence read and ignored. Okay, most of the assembly houses, like in the Virginia House of Burgesses, their focus was on Virginia. Their focus was on trying to get local issues, local ideas, local problems resolved. But in England, when this circular letter makes it to England, there's a completely different reaction. In fact, they immediately and quite passionately react against Massachusetts. Why? Because they are very, very angry at this letter. In fact, Parliament, even the King, is saying this is treason. Massachusetts, the colony, has committed treason. This is wrong. You don't go around saying that a law is wrong, and you don't go around saying how are we going to get around it, and you publicize this to everybody. No. So what do? Or what do we do to deal with Massachusetts? We basically say, first, Massachusetts, rescind that letter. And what they mean is take it back. Rescind that letter. Well, Massachusetts officially said, no, we don't rescind it. We stand by it. So what do? The royal governor of Massachusetts is ordered to disband the House of Representatives, the colonial representative assembly of Massachusetts. This is a really big deal for the colonists. It's like if they had disbanded the Virginia House of Burgesses. This is a big deal for them. And so what happens? The rest of the colonies, where they had first kind of ignored the Massachusetts circular letter, now they're all behind Massachusetts. They're all reacting to how they're being treated by England. It's almost this growing all for one for all type of spirit in the colonies. And it starts justifying to a lot of those colonists that we're thinking, maybe we need to rebel. Maybe we need to get out of England because you're violating our rights. It's giving them justification. You start seeing many merchants in a lot of the big port cities, like Philadelphia and Boston and Charlestown and New York City, starting to sign non-importation agreements, which means they are not going to import anything from British merchants. You start seeing mobs up and down these port cities demonstrating, protesting, attacking places that may have British goods. And in Boston, the local residents are ordered to start arming themselves. And this would have been considered illegal by the royal government to start arming themselves. Custom officials are reporting back to England, we can't collect any customs, any taxes. Things have gotten very, very violent. This was not what the Crown had wanted. This was not what Parliament had wanted when they were trying to get Massachusetts to rescind their letter. And what has happened now is the opposite of what they wanted. What they wanted was for them to back down. Well, now they have all 13 colonies angry. And then in 1768, more British soldiers are coming to Boston. It seems like Boston for England was the root of everything. This is where we saw the Sons of Liberty in big, big numbers. This is where we saw the protest. And so for them, they're going, okay, Boston seems to be our key problem. So in October, they send 4,000 more, not to mention all the other soldiers that are in the colonies already. These are 4,000 more, and they are being sent directly to Boston. Boston only had a population of 15,000 people. So 4,000 more soldiers that are coming and stationed in a small town of 15,000, I mean, that's a very significant number. What was also important was that this was the first time the British government had ever used soldiers to enforce a law, and they are going to Boston to enforce these new laws, these tax laws. Supposedly, these troops are going to be for the frontier, but they never went to the frontier. They stayed in Boston. So, what happens in Boston? Well, Boston, one, has to be responsible for taking care of them. Two, the soldiers, they don't get paid very well. And so they have to, some of them, look for, what can I say, look for side jobs to supplement their income, extra jobs. Well, that means they're competing against the small population of Boston, against many other men that are looking for a job in Boston. You also have the army camped in the Boston Common. The Boston Common is kind of like the town square, the kind of middle section, this kind of common greens. It were actually were called the Boston Common because they were greens. They, when they had been much smaller, had kind of shared this green area in the middle of Boston where the cattle could graze, and they could kind of had like green area in the middle of the city. Well, it kind of had stayed as kind of this maybe kind of Central Park, if you think about it, main plaza. Well, the army is camped on this Boston Common. And so they're kind of in the middle of Boston, and people see them regularly. Well, almost on a daily basis, you could say the rabble, the people that were angry at the British, are constantly harassing these soldiers every day, throwing insults at them, throwing lettuce at them, throwing tomatoes at them. Some days were a little bit more harsher than others, but this is ongoing. And finally, on March 5th, 1770, things erupt. It had been a particular violent few days. A lot of harassing of the British soldiers, a lot of name calling, tomato throwing, just a lot of pressure from some of the rabble colonists against the British. And what happens? Well, the soldiers reacted. Some soldiers are going to shoot into the Bostonian crowds. It's called the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. It is considered to be the first blood shed as far as for the revolutionary movement, the first blood shed perhaps in the Revolutionary War. It will get a lot of coverage in Sam Adams' Journal of the Times. In fact, this is from the Journal of the Times. It is an engraving done by Paul Revere. And if you see it, I mean, notice, what does the story tell you? Does it show you the story of the colonists harassing the British soldiers, or does it show you all these British soldiers with orders? You can kind of tell here with this guy ordering, shoot, 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 and you see the blood coming out of the colonists. I think you could all say this is definitely engraving that tells you, that I should say is more partial to the colonist side. And in essence, with this kind of publicity, yes, it's very much dramatized. I mean, the blood dripping that Paul Revere has in that engraving. I mean, it's just, the English are nothing but tyrants and evil. In Sam Adams' Journal of the Times, I mean, he actually says the English are tyrants, tyranny. 5 colonists will die. In fact, the first death, Crispus Attucks, becomes known as the first death in the revolutionary movement, in the War of Revolution. Interestingly enough, Crispus Attucks was a free man of color. So, what happens? Well, the colonists and those that support this cause are seeing all these deaths and this massacre as perfect example of complete villainy. The Bostonians that had died were martyrs, and the English were just the villains. Whereas the English are looking at this going, wait a minute, our soldiers are the martyrs. They're the ones under constant attack. The villains are those Bostonians. John Adams, who is one of the leaders in the Sons of Liberty, one of the leaders of this growing, what we would call patriot cause, says he will represent the soldiers, the British soldiers that shot in the crowd. He will make sure that England understands that in the colonies in Boston, all English citizens can get a fair trial. He was trying to prove that things are different here. And we too treat all people fairly. Well, things start kind of calming down after the Boston Massacre. The new Prime Minister, Lord North, is trying to make things better, particularly for English manufacturing. And he is seeing that the colonists have really affected the English trade, but also this new American colonial industry, like the furniture making, it was getting stronger and it was starting to affect English manufacturing. And so he's trying to kind of, okay, we need to start focusing on what's important. What's important is the economy. So let's focus on some things here. So he repeals the Townshend Acts, all except a tax on tea, to show the colonists that, again, Parliament is supreme over the colony. So Parliament can pass laws, pass taxes over them, repeal them, but they can do this because they are supreme over the colonies. Do the colonists kind of take a step back? Do they enjoy this kind of peaceful period? Yes and no. What you are seeing is that although you may not see as many demonstrations, the drumbeat is continuing about this no taxation without representation. The drumbeat is growing about this idea that the colonists' rights are being violated as English citizens. And who's kind of keeping that drumbeat going? People like Sam Adams, through his newspaper, the Journal of the Times, other people in Philadelphia that are also publishing newspapers. And you have another group called the Committees of Correspondence. The Committees of Correspondence are a really, really important part of this growing revolutionary movement. The Committees of Correspondence are exactly what the title suggests. They are committees, groups that are corresponding meaning they are sending letters back and forth to the different cities. And what are they talking about? They are talking about the conditions in their towns. They are talking about rights. They are talking about how they see rights are being violated. And it's this constant communication network, these links, that is completely independent of the crown, completely independent of English government. And it is uniquely American. That is keeping this drumbeat going. Okay, we may be at peace right now, but wait a minute. Look at the Tea Act. We have a tea tax. We still weren't asked. We still didn't have representation when that tea tax was passed. So they're keeping this going. They're keeping it alive, even though maybe the big protests aren't happening. In 1772, there's a little bit of an incident with an actual Royal British vessel of the British Navy. The Gaspee. This was part of the British Navy. This is an official ship. This is not a private British ship, but part of the Royal Navy. Well, in 1772, it ran aground off the Rhode Island coast. And what aground means is that and you can kind of see here in the painting, it hit the sand. It got too close to the shore, and there wasn't enough water for it to float back out. So it got stuck, okay, on the sand. Well, that could have been the end of that, and the English Navy could have figured out what to do with it. Well, while it was stuck, colonists boarded it and burned it. And you can see here in this painting from the 20th century, the burning of the Gaspee. Great Britain says the people that did these are criminals. This is treason. You don't do this. This is part of the Royal Navy. And second, you need to surrender them to us. And when you surrender them to us, we are going to try them. And we're not going to try them in the Americas. We're going to try them in England, because what they did was against us, the British Navy, against England. The colonists in Rhode Island in particular saying, wait a minute, maybe they shouldn't have done that. Maybe that was wrong. But they are to be tried by their peers. Their peers, which we have basically said are us. We will try them on the American soil. England says no. Nobody wants to give them up. And then you all have heard about what happened on Boston in December. The Boston Tea Party. What happened? The famous Tea Party that happens a year after the Gaspee. And December 16th, 1773, there is a reaction to a new tax, the Tea Act of 1773. And they throw a little party in Boston called the Boston Tea Party. So what is the Tea Act, and why are the colonists so against it? Well, the Tea Act is a very interesting little tax. What it did was it actually lowered the price of tea and still kept a tax on it, a little tax, but it was still a tax. Yet tea, British tea, was a lot cheaper, even though you're paying that tax, than if you smuggled tea in. And why? Well, basically, the act was done to help the British East India Company. The British East India Company was a company based out of India. India was one of the British colonies. And they made tea. Tea was one of their exports. And they had the royal approval. And in this royal seal of approval. And with this, that means that they had kind of special protection under the government. Well, the British East India Company had an oversupply of goods. They had too much tea. They needed to get rid of it. They needed to sell it. And so what this law does is it basically lowers the tea, and there's still a tax on it. And it was, or it hoped, that people would buy this tea because it was cheaper. Even though there was still a tax on it, it was a lot cheaper. Well, in Boston, they don't agree. And on December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty dress up as Mohawks. They board 3 ships in the Boston port, and they throw over 342 chests of tea into the harbor. At that time, it valued at about 10,000 pounds, which today is somewhere probably around $500,000. So this is a very valuable product. And for Great Britain and for Parliament, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is it. They're like, we've had enough. It's a little tax. People in England, they say, pay more taxes than you do in the colonies. And now you're dumping the tea. It's not even yours. And you're dumping it into the harbor because you don't want to pay that tax. And the colonists are saying, wait a minute. All we want is for you to recognize that we need representation. Sam Adams writes in his personal diary, "The destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epocha in history." And what he's trying to say there in kind of old colonial English is this has to be remembered in history. This is huge. This is a turning point. This is big. Well, it was a turning point, and it was very big. England will react. For the first time, England is going to have punitive laws, punitive action. And by this, we mean laws that are about punishing. This isn't about a law now to get revenue. This isn't a law about supporting the frontier. This isn't a law about anything other than, they are called the Coercive Acts of 1774. The colonists will call them the Intolerable Acts. That should tell you pretty much the English perspective and the colonial perspective. What did the coercives or intolerable acts state? 1, the Boston port is closed. Now remember, this is the most important port, really, in all the colonies, and it's being closed. And it will remain closed until the Bostonians pay full compensation to the British East India Company. 2, they are going to restructure the whole Massachusetts colonial government. They start appointing representatives to the upper house in the Massachusetts Assembly House, and really hurting them where their heart was. Massachusetts was a colony that took pride in their town hall meetings all across the villages in Massachusetts. Well, England says you are now only allowed to have one town hall meeting per year. British officials is the third point. British officials arrested for offenses committed in the colonies, in the American colonies, will be transferred to England for trial. Fourth point, there is a new quartering act. The army can quarter, which means they can go and take lodging wherever in the colonies. If it's a private home, if it's a public building, it does not matter. They can go and quarter wherever. And kind of along with that, we're sending more troops to Boston. You already have 4,000, you're getting more. Finally, they appoint a military governor in Massachusetts. So more soldiers, a military governor, soldiers can house wherever they want in Boston. You can see where the great force of Great Britain is coming down really hard on Massachusetts and in Boston. The new military governor of Massachusetts is General Thomas Gage. Another part of these intolerable acts was the Quebec Act, and I kind of separated it here because it kind of seems like it has nothing to do with Massachusetts, but it does. Basically, y'all remember the famous Ohio River Valley, which is this area south of the Great Lakes, kind of following the Ohio River. I should say for many years, traditionally, this area, the Ohio River Valley, was land that Massachusetts, which is kind of over here, but Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, they would have always said this extends forward, this is part of us. Virginia, which is kind of down in here, they would say this land is part of the American colonies. Well, Britain says no. No longer would the Ohio River Valley pertain to you all. It is now going to be part of the province of Quebec and Montreal, which had been New France. And England had created the Quebec province in this area. And they basically say Quebec will manage these lands, and they are going to make them Indian reserves. This is going to be land for Native Americans, but the management of it will be Quebec. You're no longer allowed to go and settle there. They also legalized Catholicism in this area, and they basically say they will not allow any representative assemblies to be built in this area, and you cannot have trials by jury in this area. And this Trans-Appalachian region had been considered to be part of the 13 colonies. It was the whole reason for the French Indian War, if y'all remember. And this really gets to a big issue for the colonies. It kind of hurts them in the heart, and it hurts Massachusetts tremendously. Well, what are the repercussions? The whole goal of these coercive acts was very simple: to make Massachusetts an example of British power, to show the rest of the colonies what happens when you go against British law and against the supreme power of Britain. There are repercussions, there are punishments. So they are very much trying to make an example of Massachusetts to the rest of the colonies. Don't follow what they do, this will happen to you. Another thing they're trying to do is separate Massachusetts, kind of isolate it. They are seeing that the majority of the protests and demonstrations is coming from Boston and the Massachusetts area, so they're trying to isolate it. That is the goal, okay? This is what the British want to accomplish. They completely fail. It doesn't even come near to what they accomplish, because what they end up doing is quite the opposite. The colonies are going to unite against Massachusetts. They identify with Massachusetts. They feel this apprehension. What if what happened to Massachusetts happens to us? What if they shut down Charlestown down in South Carolina, or the New York City port? What if this is us? So it unites them. In fact, they start defending Massachusetts. They start sending food and money to Massachusetts. And it becomes huge. It becomes a rallying cry for the colonies. Thomas Jefferson, who was a Virginia lawyer at the time, stated, "Nothing united the colonists more than the belief that Boston people were being deprived of their rights as Englishmen, and that their rights too, if you think about it, could be deprived, because they are Englishmen as well." This does the opposite of what England wanted. They were trying to isolate Massachusetts, show the colonies what happens when you are bad. The colonists go the other way. They unite with Massachusetts. And on September 5th, 1774, there is a big call for another intercolonial gathering. The first Continental Congress held in Philadelphia, which is kind of in the middle of all the colonies, and it will be held in Carpenter Hall. All 13 colonies again are asked to send representatives. 12 of them do. Georgia does not. And again, remember, Georgia is the youngest of all the colonies. It is the smallest in population of all the colonies. So it was always kind of hard for Georgia to get organized and get going. But they do send word that they will agree to whatever they decide at this Congress. They will support the resolutions. The First Continental Congress is meeting to discuss the coercive acts, the intolerable acts, and what to do. And who goes? Many of the respected leaders from many regions, many of these individuals that have been either talking about no taxation without representation, that have been issuing these battle cries. From Massachusetts, you have John Adams. You have Sam Adams as well. From Virginia, you have Patrick Henry, the author of the phrase, no taxation without representation. You get Richard Henry Lee, who is considered one of the most wealthiest and most successful of all the landed gentry. He was kind of one of the most influential men of Virginia. George Washington, a noted English soldier. He had fought with the English. He was now a very successful farmer, plantation owner. From Pennsylvania, they had the star, the big celebrity, Benjamin Franklin, who lived in Philadelphia. And what happens? Well, if you think about it, this is kind of one of the first times that a lot of these people are meeting, and they're kind of getting to know each other and where they stand. And you start seeing already kind of factions developing. There was the moderate group that kind of wanted to work on just the intolerable acts and see what could be done. And then already there was a radical group forming, a group that wanted more than just negotiating with England, a group that was already starting to talk about rebellion. What they end up doing at the First Continental Congress is passing resolutions. Resolutions, again, are just kind of formal declarations, so to speak, or formal statements. And these resolutions are aimed at Britain, and they say Britain must change its policy. They must revoke the coercive acts. They also established the association. The association was an organization made to enforce the boycott, to make sure that people weren't boycotting English goods. So they have reinstituted the boycott. So what have they done? They have sent petitions through their resolutions. They have also basically organized a boycott again, and they are encouraging protest. They make one last resolution that they will meet in 1 year if things are not resolved. On April 18th, 1775, sorry guys, went the wrong way. On April 18th, 1775, we can honestly say things have not gotten better. What happens? Well, in Boston, General Gage has heard of some interesting things happening in some villages outside of Boston, Lexington and Concord. In these villages, he is hearing that the colonists are stockpiling weapons, particularly gunpowder. Gunpowder is extremely valuable and very hard to find if you don't have the resources. And he also hears that Sam Adams and John Adams, which actually were no longer in Boston, were hiding out there. There were arrest warrants for Sam Adams and John Adams because they had been instigating rebellious ideas. Sam Adams and John Adams called themselves patriots. They were patriots, not rebels. Anyway, General Gage is hearing that they may be in Lexington and Concord, and he wants to collect this stockpile of weapons and gunpowder. And so he basically dispatches troops from Boston to seize the rebel supplies and to seize, if they see Adams, the Adams cousins, I should say. They're supposed to do it quietly. They're supposed to escape at night to Boston, cross the river, and get to Lexington and Concord with little notice. It's all supposed to be surprise. Well, the Patriots are organized. They have been watching. And at midnight, there is basically a chain of riders that are going out and sending word to Lexington and Concord that the British are coming. It's called the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. But he had help. Samuel Prescott and William Dawes Jr. As Revere jumps, Prescott gets on, and then Dawes, they take turns. They meet, and the other one takes up the rest of the road. And remember, the British have a way of saying they're doing it quietly, but with those big old red coats and marching of drums, they didn't do it too quietly, and everybody kind of knew that they were coming. In 1860, about a little short of our first centennial anniversary, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, one of the most famous American poets, writes a very, very famous poem called Paul Revere's Ride. And in it, the very famous line, "The British are coming, the British are coming." On April 19th, 1775, we have the first skirmish of the Revolutionary War. It's often said the shot heard around the world. On April 19th, 1775 in Lexington, a local militia unit known as the Minutemen were ready, armed, and waiting in the Lexington Common. Now, who were the Minutemen? The Minutemen were basically farmers, tradesmen, local people in and around Lexington that had been trained that when they heard the sound, a horn usually from the center of Lexington, to get ready with their guns, their muskets, everything, and protect the town in a minute's notice. Hence the name, the Minutemen. And so, I mean, this is something that was done to protect them from Native Americans, to protect them from any other kind of hostilities, including British soldiers. The Minutemen were ready, 70 of them, and the British arrived. Who shot first? We're not quite sure. It is believed that the English shot first. Others have said it was the Minutemen. But anyhow, at the end of this skirmish, because it's not a battle, it's a skirmish, 8 colonists lay dead and 10 were wounded. The shot heard around the world is because this skirmish will have, when we look at global history, repercussions around the world. In many ways, it is the start of the American Revolutionary War. And that war brings a whole new country that has a very different type of government again. And so it's been joked, or not joked is not the word, it's been said, I guess, that one shot in Lexington changed the world. It was the birth of the United States of America. After Lexington, and here is a drawing about what happened at Lexington over here, the many British soldiers, and you can actually see, guys, how formal, even in this drawing that looks a little chaotic, you can see the formal fighting of the British, and over here, the Minutemen. Obviously not as many as the British over there, and you kind of see the disorganization, but at the same time, you see how they just fight with purpose, and over here, this old-fashioned way of fighting. Yeah, we're not, sorry, that shouldn't be there. From Lexington, the British then march on to Concord. And as they are marching on to Concord, Minutemen from all over the countryside are starting to pour along the roads. When they get to Concord, they're actually stopped at the Old North Bridge. And here you see where many of the Minutemen that have poured from the countryside have basically made their stand, and they stop the British. The British decide not to go into Concord. Did they find anything, or the Adams cousins? No, they really didn't. But something very interesting happens. As they start returning to Boston, it was a long road, a long trek, something very significant, a spoiler, so to speak, of what may happen in the future. These Minutemen have been marching. A lot of them didn't make it to Concord, and they've made it to the country. They've made it from the countryside to the road. They're starting to do guerrilla warfare attacks, hit and run tactics from the woods, as the British with their big old redcoats are marching through the road. 73 soldiers are killed in this kind of ambush style. It's a very long march back to Boston. And it is the first evidence of the colonial or patriot use of guerrilla warfare. Oops, sorry. And I wanted to show you a little cartoon. It is from, let me see the time. I may have to show it to y'all next week. But It's called The Shot Heard Around the World. It is from 1976, so don't laugh at that. But it is from 1976 when we had our bicentennial, and I was just a wee little kid. And every Saturday morning you saw cartoons, and they would do this to educate the kids about the revolution. And there's a lot about here, as well as spoilers for what's going to come in this little cartoon. And it's a great way of actually remembering the Revolutionary War. So let's see if I can, I guess it doesn't work. It works when I zoom. Anybody know how I can get it to work? Darn. Well, sorry guys. I guess I'll figure it out and I'll show it to you all on Tuesday. We'll continue. So what happens now? Well, we now have another call. On May 10th, 1775, there is a call, because things haven't gotten much better, for another intercolonial gathering, the Second Continental Congress. They meet in Philadelphia, same hall, Carpenter Hall, on May 10th, 1775. And again, delegates from all colonies are sent, except for Georgia. But Georgia again says we agree to everything that's happening, and we will actually send some representatives later. And they do. It is open to the public, just like the First Continental Congress had been. If the public wants to go in and see them debate, they are more than welcome to go. Very quickly, two factions or delegations quickly are kind of evident. There is the conservative delegation that kind of wants peace, and they want to negotiate still with the king, and they want to say they're still loyal, and they want to find a way to actually make things work. And the leader of this group would have been John Dickinson. And then there is the radical group, the group that has already basically said, there is no way we can fix this. We need to do what is logical, declare independence. They were led by Samuel Adams from Massachusetts and Patrick Henry from Virginia. And so it's a big dilemma. What do we do? In the beginning of the Continental Congress, the conservative faction has a little more influence, a little more votes, because people aren't still quite there yet about declaring independence. Maybe something peaceful can be done. Maybe they can still give us representation. We can still work these things out. But slowly, and this is a Congress, guys, this Second Continental Congress will be convened for years. It doesn't just end in a month. It's going to go on for years. But slowly through the months, getting to 1776, the radical delegation grows and grows and grows. I also want you all to understand this is a really big deal. The dilemma that these individual men have on their shoulders. Because if they did declare themselves independent, and if it failed, they will be killed at sight. They are traitors. They also have to convince their fellow colonists. Not everybody is going to support what they're doing. And they also have to get help should they declare themselves independent from foreign governments. They don't have weapons. They don't have arms. They don't have gunpowder. You don't win a war on a declaration only. So this is a very huge, huge decision on their shoulders. So in the beginning, the idea of peace sounds a little bit better. Benjamin Franklin definitely is the star at the Second Continental Congress, and he makes the most of it. He wanted everybody to know that he was participating in this. And one of the things he would do is actually, on various occasions, hire prisoners from the jails and have them carry him on a bed when he didn't feel well to the actual Carpenter Hall. And it would be a huge spectacle. And he would throw like coins to people. He was a character, as we say. Anyhow, painting of the Second Continental Congress, and you have here not George Washington. He was actually not always there, and we'll talk about that later. But at the Second Continental Congress, this is John Hancock, who will be elected president of the Second Continental Congress. Okay, things are going to be happening in two different places, actually in many different places, all at the same time. You have the Second Continental Congress happening in Philadelphia. One of the first things that they are going to do is organize an army. an army to protect themselves. They call it the Continental Army. While they're doing other things and they're organizing that Continental Army, in Boston, that Continental Army will be engaged in battles. On June 17th, 1775, you have the first official battle of the Revolutionary War in Boston. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill is the first formal battle of the War of Independence, but it is also a battle that shows some very important things about this War of Independence. Basically, these Patriot soldiers, about 1,000 of them, had tried to surround Boston. And they had their fortification, their kind of headquarters, on a hill called Breed's Hill. Bunker Hill is actually the next hill next to Breed's Hill, but the battle is known as Bunker Hill. The British will try to dislodge the Americans from Breed's Hill, and that is led by General William Howe. He tries 3 attacks to dislodge the Americans from their headquarters. The Americans are low on ammunition. They realize that they are completely outnumbered by the British soldiers and that more than likely they're probably going to lose. But their American general states a really famous line: don't shoot until you see the white of their eyes. And what he's meaning is don't shoot until you know you have a sure shot. At least we can maybe get out of this somewhat alive. They're low on ammunition, and he's trying to save ammunition. Well, the British win. They dislodge the Americans. They overpower them. The Americans lose the first battle of the War of Independence, but at a great cost. 40% of the redcoats of the British soldiers were killed. About 1,000 soldiers. It shows, one, how great a shot those Americans are, and two, it also shows the weakness of the British. Why? Because been lost, that's hard. They have to go all the way back to England, get the soldiers, bring the soldiers back. I mean, this is long for them. This is hard for them. They can't afford to be losing soldiers like this. The Americans they lost people, but nothing to the extent that the British did at the Battle of Bunker Hill. But back at the Second Continental Congress, they're going to hear about this and they're like, oh no. Now, just some quick things. This is a nice thing kind of what is going to be happening at the at the Second Continental Congress. I told you one of the first things they do is put together a Continental Army, and they get George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of this army. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. They will get a committee to negotiate with foreign countries. They will start printing their own money, and they're going to eventually, by 1776, declare independence. This is just some of the stuff that they are going to be doing throughout the time they are in session. What I want to focus real quick, and then I'll let you all go, is really on the first thing they did. They kind of do 1 and 2 here, the Olive Branch Petition and the Continental Army at the same time. The Olive Branch Petition was sent and arrived in England in July 1775. It is basically those moderates trying to get peace with England. It states they are loyal to the king. They declare loyalty to the king, and this petition is going directly to the king. It's an olive branch. You all know olive branch is the sign of peace. It states that Parliament is the one passing laws over them. Parliament is evil. And it also explains to the king that this army that they have organized, this Continental Army, is not to fight for independence. It is to protect them against these soldiers that Parliament is having attack them.